Rohit, here is the platform is yours now to introduce the speaker. Thank you.
So, but before I introduce the speaker, I want to say a few words about Professor Amitabh Gupta, who was professor of philosophy at IIT Bombay, right? And he was one of the founders of the Indian Conference in Logic and Applications, right? And the first meetings of that conference, which is very vibrant and very large, the first three meetings of which took place at IIT Mumbai, and then after that it wandered around. It's been in Delhi, in Assam, in Chennai, and so on and so forth. So I'm afraid that his wife died a few years ago, and since then he has not been well, and I'm afraid his life wasn't that great. He just passed away last week, and what I would like to ask is that we observe a minute of silence in his memory. All right, then let me say a few words about our speaker. I had not realized that he's actually English. Right? He was born in South. I think he did tell me that he was English, but I have a bad memory and tend to forget these things. So I have always associated him with Australia, right? And I found out that his first degree, his doctorate, was at the London School of Mathematics, London School of Economics, and it is a degree in mathematics. So maybe he and Ravi Kulkarni, not to mention me and Jayant, there are four people here: Kulkarni, me, Jayant Shah, and our speaker Graham. All four with PhDs in mathematics, right? And at least Graham and I are keenly interested in philosophy. Ravi is also very interested in philosophy, and I think so is Jayant. Okay, so after LSE and a stint in Scotland, then he spent many decades in Australia, right? And where he's been a very prominent figure, president of the Australasian Association for Logic, and then since 2009, he has been distinguished professor at the Graduate Center of CUNY, right? And so, of course, he's been my colleague now for 16 years. Now, he has several interests, and I would say that what he first founded his belief on, at least to my knowledge, is in paraconsistent logic, which is a way of saying that a contradiction need not be false. And I don't know if he's aware of this, but there is this famous question to the Buddha about, I think, asked by a man called Malunkyaputta, namely after the saint's death. Does the saint exist? So does the saint not exist? Does the saint neither exist nor does not exist, or does the saint exist and not exist? Right? And this is a question actually asked of the Buddha by this Malukya. And I would say that certainly the Buddha would have been interested to talk to Graham about such issues. Okay, so I would I hesitate. I'm reluctant not to mention his recent work, which I think is, if you'll forgive my saying that, more important than anything else he has done so far. And that is about the fact that actually there are always two words: the word in which we live, our personal word in which we are at the center, and then there's the word in science in which there is no center. All human beings are equal, right? And those two words exist, and in some sense they are both true, right? And Priest has offered an analogy of a Mobius strip, which doesn't actually have two sides, but has one side, and in some way reconciles these two words, the personal word and the impersonal word, right? Just one last comment is that I've been to Buddhist meditation groups, and sometimes there is a transition that some people make where they're able to go from the word where they're the center to a word in which there is no center. I don't know what this amounts to and whether this is the same as the phenomenon of Satori or something else. But I would say this is a very important paper. So we welcome Graham Priest. We should be flattered and pleased that he's going to speak to us, and I'm sure it's going to be very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit. Let me share my screen. So let me tell you what I want to talk about. Look, it's no secret, I think, that the world is facing an environmental crisis due to global warming. The days when any kind of rational denial was plausible, and the result of the environmental change is going to make life very difficult for many people now alive and many more people in the future. Now, why should one care, and what should one do about it? Well, these are questions that I think concern any thoughtful person. But the answer, of course, depends on your views, your philosophical views, and crucially, your views on ethical and political matters. Now, what I intend to do in this talk is to address those questions from the perspective of Buddhist philosophy. Let me make it clear that, first of all, I'm not talking about Buddhist religion, I'm talking about Buddhist philosophical views. Let me say also that I don't intend to defend those views here, though I do think that they're largely correct. So what I'm going to do is the following. There are essentially two parts of the talk. The first part is an exegesis of the relevant aspects of Buddhist ethics and Buddhist metaphysics. Some of you may know these things, but I'm not going to assume that you do. So if you know these things, apologies. It will be something of a repetition. However, once that's cleared up, I will then turn to the environmental issues that I talked about and address the questions of why should one care and what should one do about it. So that's where we're going. So let's start with an elementary guide to Buddhist ethics. So first of all, the main elements of Buddhist ethics are contained in the first sermon that the Buddha gave after he'd attained enlightenment, or said he'd attained enlightenment. And this contained the Four Noble Truths. And so let me talk about those. This is going to be rather swift. So there are Four Noble Truths. The Noble Truths characterize what you might call the human condition and what one might do to make it better. It has the form of a sort of medical investigation. There's an illness, there's a cause, there's a prognosis, and there's a cure. So those are the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is that life is characterized by dukkha. The Buddhist texts are written in Indian Buddhist texts are written standardly in two languages, Pali and Sanskrit. I'm going to stick to the Sanskrit. Dukkha is a Sanskrit word. Its standard translation is suffering. Standard translation to English is suffering, but that's not a great translation because its semantic ambit is much wider. It's suffering, pain, discontent, unsatisfactoriness, unhappiness, sorrow, affliction, anxiety, dissatisfaction, discomfort, anguish, stress, misery, frustration. All those are part of dukkha. And they're the kind of things you really don't want in life. Okay? But life is like that. It's hard to deny this. Everyone gets old, becomes infirm. Actually, if they're lucky to live long enough, they lose possessions. They might have a marriage breakup. They might lose kids. Everybody has troubles in life. I don't think that's a contentious observation. Of course, that's not to deny there are good things in life too. We can enjoy achieving something we aimed at, the joys of a beauty of an opera or a sunset. But these things also come with an edge because when they finish, as they always do, we feel sad and we wanted them to go on longer. And often we find that the things we wanted to achieve, when we achieve them, really do not provide the satisfaction that we thought. So that's the first noble truth. The second noble, well, before we get to that, I mean, it's normally assumed that dukkha is bad and should be eliminated or at least alleviated. Now, I think that's philosophically contentious, but let me say, if you like headaches and your kid's going off the rails and maybe getting cancer, then Buddhism has nothing for you. Okay, so the second noble truth is that dukkha has three causes of poisons, kleshas, and they are possessiveness, raga, hate, dvesha, and ignorance, moha. So take hatred first. Things happen, we hate them, and so we feel unhappy. So that's to do with the affective attitude we bring to the things that happen in our lives. Possessiveness, well, we all things and we try to get them. We can't always, we get dissatisfied. When we get them, we often lose them. That causes more dukkha. And so both the first two are about the affective attitude we bring to bear on the things that happen in our lives. Ignorance is slightly different. We misunderstand the world in which we live. We don't understand how it works, or maybe we sometimes delude ourselves into think it works differently. So those are the second noble truth. The causes of dukkha is the three kleshas. Okay, third noble truth is kind of fairly straightforward. Get rid of the causes and you get rid of the effects. So change your affective attitude to what happens in life, understand the world in which you live, and the dukkha will go away, or at least be minimized. And then the fourth noble truth is something called the Eightfold Noble Path, which is a series of practices which you can undertake at the same time to try to have the effect of getting rid of the causes of dukkha. And they're usually broken up into three groups. Wisdom, first of all, right view, understand how the world really works, right intention, and intend to do something about changing your behavior, your beliefs, and so on to get rid of your dukkha. Right action. There are three parts of this. Right action. Don't lie. Oh, no, that's speech. Don't kill. Don't be cruel to people. Right speech. Don't lie. Don't speak ill of people. Right livelihood. Don't make your living from things which cause suffering, such as working in an abattoir or making armaments. So your actions should be kind and compassionate and not cruel and harmful. And mental state, right effort. No one said that getting rid of these attitudes is hard. They're probably programmed into us because of our evolution. Of course, though, the Buddha knew nothing of that. Right? Mindfulness, be aware of what your mind and your body are doing. All of us run on autopilot a lot of the time and do damage to ourselves and others unawares. And right, wander, otherwise you won't achieve anything much. Focus. Okay, so those are the Four Noble Truths. There's, of course, a lot more to be said about them, but I'm sure you get the basic idea. So we haven't finished with ethics yet. There's something else to talk about, which is Karuna. Karuna, so where were we? So I explained to you the outlines of the Four Noble Truths. And if we left matters at that, I think things would be very misleading, because it might suggest that the aim of Buddhist ethics is to eliminate your own dukkha. But that will be misleading, because one should aim to eliminate not one's own dukkha, not only one's own dukkha, but those of other people.
Right.
So this is where this thing called karuna becomes important. So karuna, the translation, standard translation, is compassion. That's not a great translation, because compassion suggests suffering with someone, and karuna is a very active state where you act to decrease the dukkha of yourself and others. And karuna is a central virtue of Buddhism. And in fact, it's the central virtue of later Buddhism, which is Mahayana Buddhism, which starts around the turn of the Common Era. A better translation, I think, is care, because care is something that's active, and you can care for yourself as well as others. So I'll try to stick to care. All right. So why should you care for yourself and for other people? Well, why you should care for yourself is pretty obvious. It's just prudence. But why should you care for other people? And the answer is that you should care for other people because suffering or dukkha is bad, and you should get rid of bad things. It's as simple as that. And it doesn't matter that the suffering is not mine. It's bad for anybody. So racism and patriarchy are bad, and should be gotten rid of. And it makes absolutely no difference that I'm a white male and have never suffered from either. You get rid of the bad things in the world, and suffering is bad. Let me give you a quote from this guy, Shantideva, who's probably the greatest of the Buddhist ethicists around the 8th century, who makes this point as follows. I should prevent the suffering of others, because it is suffering, like my own suffering. I should be benevolent to others, because they are beings just as I am myself a being. Since I and others are exactly alike in desiring happiness, what's so special about me that justifies striving after only my own happiness? Since fear and suffering are unwanted by both me and others, what's so special about me that I protect this and not that? Okay, and I think he's right about that. So before we end the discussion of ethics, let me just say two things. You might think that it follows from what I said, that all you got to do is change your headspace and everything will be all right. That's not correct, because if the causes cause bad things, then the rationale for getting rid of all of them is the same. And lots of the causes of suffering are material. Okay, people get ill, they're involved in wars, and all the other unhappy material things that happen in life. So one should try to get rid of those too. In fact, following the Noble Eightfold Path is not easy. It's hard to do. In fact, it's impossible to do if you're in the middle of a war zone, or you're worrying about where your kid's next meal is coming from, or you're suffering on the street. You live on the street in New York City and in the middle of a cold, freezing winter night. So of course, one should get rid of the material causes of suffering as well. That's the first point. The second point is this. Karuna is caring for people. What people? So how broad is the ambit of Karuna? Okay. To answer that question, we have to turn from Buddhist ethics to Buddhist metaphysics. And I should say that schools of Buddhist philosophy are many, and there are often very significant differences between their metaphysical picture, but we're not going to go far beyond what is pretty much common to all of them. So the standard story that you get in the sutras is that reality has three marks: anicca, impermanence. Anything in the causal flux comes into existence, is maintained for a while, and then goes out of existence. That's impermanence. Dukkha, which we've already talked about, and anatman, no self. Now, I'm going to talk about anatman a lot more in a minute, but let me say first of all that what's behind all these three things is another Buddhist view called tyasamutpa, usually translated as dependent origination or dependent arising. And the thought is that whatever happens is brought about by a combination of causes which bring it into being, affect how it continues, and then the causes conspire for it to end. And that's really behind all of these views. So anicca is the view that things go out of existence when their dependent origination causes cease. Dukkha is the thought that we suffer when things do end because we're attached to them. And anatman, well, we'll come back to that in a moment. But before I get to that, I don't think pratityasamutpada is terribly contentious. Everything in the causal flux, we know it's brought about by a bunch of causes, and that has a bunch of effects. But I think where we fail to think is to see how broad this view is. Let me just give you an example. Let's suppose I go into a coffee shop in Manhattan and buy a coffee. How is that possible? Well, first of all, the beans come from another country, probably somewhere in South America. The energy for the plants growing came from the sun. The plant was watered by local streams and rainfall. The beans were picked by someone in that country who probably earns a lot less than I do. Then the beans had to be brought to the United States. This was done by ships from another country with sailors who probably work in a different country, fueled by coal, which was probably mined in yet another country. And then when it arrives, it's got to be roasted by the distributors and then distributed. And that depends, how that's done depends on laws passed by the state legislature and federal legislature. And that depends on a bunch of people acting in certain ways. And then the coffee's got to be served by the people in the shop, and they have lives of their own. Many of them are students and working to do their degrees. And I interact with them and chat with them. And those are the causes. And maybe, I have a cup of coffee and then I get a migraine. So I miss a meeting. So I'm not there to give important information. And so a decision is made, which is not great. And then people suffer as a result of that. Okay, look, this is just a very simple and straightforward example. But you can see that my simple cup of coffee connects me big time to a lot of other people and a lot of the material world. We're deeply dependent on social and environmental interconnections. And this is just a very trivial example. Here's a thought experiment. When you have 5 minutes, take any event that you do and think about all the things that have made this possible, its causal history, and possibly some of its effects. And you will see that we're deeply embedded, we're deeply integrated people in both the social and natural world. Okay, so with that sort of word, let's speak about anatman, which is, strictly speaking, the translation is no self. And originally the view of anatman was produced by the Buddha in contrast to the Hindu view that one has atman. Now, an atman in this sense is a part of a person which remains constant while they exist, which in fact defines the person as that very person. I believe that is a standard Hindu view, and the Buddha denied it. So what people are is essentially a work in progress. They have no essence, if you like, but they're a bunch of parts which are held together by various causal processes and are changing all the time. There's no self, no essence to being a person. The closest analog, I think, in Western philosophy is the soul. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty much the same. So that's how the view started. It was a view concerning persons, but it soon became generalized to all things. So what happens to the view is that nothing has an essence. So all things depend for being what they are on some other things. Some of their parts, causes and effects, and our concepts. So some at least of those are involved. So let me give you an example. Let's take a rubber tree in the Brazilian rainforest. It depends on its parts. If it had the parts of a goldfish, it wouldn't be a tree at all, let alone the rubber tree it is. It depends on causes and effects. Because had it grown from a grain of rice and not a rubber seed plant, the seed of a rubber tree, it wouldn't have been a rubber tree. And perhaps more controversially, it depends on concepts. What it is depends on who's conceptualizing it. So for someone from indigenous person from the forest, it's a producer of rubber to make the things they need to live. For an environmentalist, it's part of a balanced ecology of the world because of the function of the rainforest in controlling carbon emissions. For someone who raises cattle as a franchise at McDonald's, it's just a plain nuisance because it's got to be cleared to raise cattle. So what it is depends on how they think of it. So this is just an example of how nothing has an essence. Everything is what it is depending on other things. So let me give you a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, who died a couple of years ago. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist, and he says the following: "For a table to exist, we need wood, a carpenter, time, skillfulness, and many other causes. And each of these causes needs other causes to be. The wood needs the forest, the sunshine, the rain, and so on. The carpenter needs his parents, breakfast, fresh air, and so on. And each of those things in turn has to be brought about by many other conditions. If we continue to look in this way, we'll see that nothing has been left out. Everything in the cosmos has come together to bring us this table. Looking deeply in the sunshine, the leaves of the tree, and the clouds, we can see the table. This one can be seen in the one can be seen in the all, and the all can be seen in the one. And things arise because of their interdependence, and that is why nothing has a separate, independent identity." In other words, I said, well, what is the ambit of compassion? Well, because of tyasamutpa, you can see it's very wise. Thich Nhat Hanh thinks it goes everywhere. Maybe that's more than, well, that's a standard view in Zen, but certainly it goes very, very far. In some sense, we are connected with much of the natural environmental world, and probably most people in the past and probably many people in the future. So this is a quote from J. Garfield, and it comes back to the question of who we should care for. To cultivate care is to recognize both the omnipresence of suffering and our interconnectedness through the web of dependent origination. It's to recognize that one cannot solve even the problem of one's own suffering without caring for that of others as well, given our essentially social nature and the claims that nature ensures we make upon one another. Okay, so that's the end of the first part of the talk. I've described some fairly standard Buddhist ethical environmental views. So with those in the background, let's now talk to the environmental issues. Okay, first of all, the looming crisis. Now, let me make it plain. There's nothing wrong with changing the environment. We and other sentient creatures have been doing so as long as there have been people, and much of this has been for the better. We've made people more food secure by our farming practices. We've got rid of many noxious bacteria. We've got rid of many parasites and other things which cause human suffering. We've changed the built environment so that people have a better place to live, which doesn't cause diseases. We've changed human sanitation, which has got rid on top of a lot of diseases. So all these have helped people. So there is nothing wrong with changing the environment. The trouble is that some changes in the environment do not work to help people. And in particular, since the Industrial Revolution, we've been increasing the temperature of the planet with consequences that are now becoming devastating. You've probably seen these statistics, but let me remind you of them. The Earth's temperature has risen by an average of 0.06 degrees centigrade per decade since 1850. That's about, so far, 1.1%, 1.1 degrees in total. The rate of warming since 1982 is more than 3 times as fast. That is 0.2 degrees per decade. 2024 was the warmest year since global records began in 1850 by a wide margin. 1.18 degrees above the 20th century average of 13.9 degrees and 1.35 degrees above the pre-industrial average of 1850 to 1900. And the 10 warmest years in the historical record have all occurred in the past decade, 2015 to 2024. Let me show you a graph of this. Okay, look, this speaks for itself. So there's a kind of 0 point around 1940, and you can see what's happened to the temperature since then. Look at this bit. Now there's a blip here. That was caused by COVID. But take that away, and what you can see is this. If you're a mathematician, you will recognize an exponential growth. And if you know what that means, you should be scared. Okay, because what are the effects of this exponential climate change? Well, first of all, we're going to be witnessing the melting of glaciers and polar ice caps, resulting in rising sea levels. We're seeing and already seeing more frequently extreme weather conditions, such as fires, droughts, and floods in the US, in Europe, in Australia, and elsewhere in the world. This is going to lead to the disruption of arable lands. You've only got to think how much of the world's arable lands occur near the coast, which is probably going to be underwater. We've seen, or we will see, the destruction of various ecosystems on which the world depends. I've already mentioned, or hinted at, the destruction of the Brazilian rainforest, which contains a lot of species which ultimately we depend on because of the integrated nature of ecology. Okay, so the effects, what are the effects going to be? Migration, people are going to be moving away from the coast. And we've already seen, what damage, social damage migration causes. We're going to see food and clean water insecurity because of the disruption to food and water supplies. We're going to see increasing competition for resources, including prime resources and markets. And this is taking place when there is already friction between the world's major economies, the US, Europe, China, India. So we're going to see increased conflict, and it's quite possible that those will become military conflicts, not at all impossible. So I don't think I need to insult your intelligence by pointing out how much dukkha this is going to cause. All right. Now, some people I've heard say that it's not really important because they're well off. I'm all right, Jack. Thanks very much. Some people in the global north might think they can hunker down and avoid the consequences. They can't. Well, Buddhist philosophy provides two standard answers to this. That attitude is ethically vicious because it's about as far from compassion as you can possibly get. So ethically, it's a highly problematic view. Secondly, it's just plain false because of the interconnectedness of us, all of us, then everything that happens is going to affect everybody. So the world is not just ecologically connected, but socially and economically connected. And everybody is going to be affected by new diseases caused by the new environmental conditions, economic shortages, food, energy, primary resources, social disruption caused by mass migration, increased international competition and wars, maybe military. These are things which will affect everybody, however rich they are. So the ostrich reaction is really not on. Okay, so what's to be done? Well, this is everybody's problem. There are some actors who are more important than others. So the major world economies of the United States, China, India, Europe cause much more pollution, much more greenhouse gas emission than many other places. But in the end, if one person acts and others don't, this will have little effect. So action has to be global. So, a utopian solution will be to have a world body who takes action about how to stop the emission of greenhouse gases and has the teeth to enforce it. That is not going to happen because most nation states will not accept the curtailment of their autonomy. So that is a non-starter. Even worse, even if we stopped or if we capped the emission of greenhouse gases now, temperatures would still increase for quite a long time. This is because of a physical phenomenon called hysteresis. It takes time for these changes to have their effect and work through the system. And something even more worrying is that we now may be even past the point of no return. Again, if you know something about the mathematics of catastrophes, changes can be sudden and then take us to a point past the point of no return. We may be there now. Some climate scientists have speculated this. So this is kind of worrying. Okay, so what could be done? Well, we should at least try to slow down the changes. We can do that. So we can underwrite the R&D of cleaner technologies, for example, taxing and producing the use of fossil fuels and using the tax subsidies to develop renewable energy and sharing the results with the countries in the global south, who are the ones that are initially going to suffer most from global warming, although they've done the least to cause it. We could bring back coal and oil production. setting strict emission limits on cars, power plants, and other heavy polluters. And all this with a concern for those who will have to move to different jobs as a result. We can expand public transportation and diminish the reliance on private motor vehicles and air travel. We can implement sustainable food production and forestry and encourage people to move away from a meat-consuming diet, which is heavily involved in the production of greenhouse gases because of farming and animal livelihood. Okay, and of course, we might encourage measures to stop population growth through education, family planning, and so on. Okay, so all those are things we could and should be doing. But there's something else, because what's going to be ahead of us, even if we manage to slow it down, is going to cause a lot of problems, as I've already indicated. So what do we need to do? Well, first of all, we need to educate people about the pending situation so they know what's going to happen and are prepared for it as best they can be. We need to accommodate mass migration because we're going to see it big time. We need to be prepared to deal with more extreme weather events, such as fires and flooding. We need to move to a sustainable energy and food systems which can work under conditions of increased strain. Okay, so these are all the things we should be doing. In fact, you might think we should be doing even more than that. We should be thinking about at least the possibility of a total collapse of the world's economic and social system and what we do to pick ourselves up afterwards. I'll let you think about that. So I've spoken a lot about the effects of global warming. Let me finish by speaking a little bit about the causes. And behind what's happening, I think it's not difficult to see capitalism. So here's the idiot's guide to capitalism. Capitalism is a socio-economic formation of production which is controlled by capital. And what's capital? Capital is a form of value whose nature is to make more value, or if you want to put it in standard terms, profit. That is, profit is the rationale of capital. And that is, making more profit is what it's there for. That is, its very rationale is growth. Okay. To this end, capital is controlled by a few persons, human or legal, but to grow it requires the work of the many. But the system doesn't work for them, however. It works simply for growth. And this subjects the many to things such as exploitation, alienation, dehumanization, and disempowerment. Now, I know those views are controversial. I'm happy to discuss them, but set them aside because that's not what concerns me now. What concerns me now is the effect of capitalism on the environment. So capitalism, the greenhouse emission is caused by the Industrial Revolution at the start of the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and growth required more energy. Energy was produced by the petrochemical industry, which is itself an enormous capital enterprise, and so wants to grow because it's a capital enterprise. Okay, so the initial cause of global warming goes back a couple of hundred years. Of course, it hasn't become significant until maybe the last 80 years. But the exponential growth of greenhouse gas emission is just a consequence of the need for capital to grow and to produce more energy, and so a heavier dependence on the petrochemical industry. So what we see now is that what we're witnessing is that the exponential growth of greenhouse gas emissions really is a feature of capitalism. Okay, so maybe you think we could change to renewable energy completely straight away, and that would solve the problem. But it won't, because capitalism impacts on the environment in other ways as well. For example, it destroys the natural environment. I've talked about the Brazilian rainforest. The destruction of the Brazilian rainforest not only increases the emission of greenhouse gases, but it destroys God knows how many species on which we ultimately depend for our own existence. Current agricultural processes rely heavily on fertilizers. Fertilizers are produced by the petrochemical industry, and the use of fertilizers causes desalination and land erosion. Okay. Capitalism needs to make a profit, so it will do as much as it can in a way it doesn't have to pay for it. Economists call these externalities. And in particular, they will get rid of waste products into the environment, causing pollution and human health problems. And of course, they have to sell what they produce. So advertising has produced the consumer society, which we buy things we don't need and throw them away, causing even more pollution. So even without global warming, this is not sustainable. The Earth is a finite quantity, and we cannot go on using its resources in an exponential fashion. So this is a very nice quote from Gary Leach. Just to hammer this home, the United States, with only 4% of the world's population, consumes 25% energy production and 50% of the global production of raw materials, while generating 40% of the world's waste. Clearly, there's not sufficient natural resources or places on the planet to store the waste generated to permit it's now nearer 8 billion people to the same materialistic standard of living enjoyed by 300 million people in the United States. He's dead right. So our current economic system is not sustainable, even for reasons nothing to do with global global emission of greenhouse gases. Okay, so when thinking about planning for the future, another important thing we should be thinking about is the reconstruction of economic production in a way that's both sustainable and humane. That is, where wealth works for people and not vice versa. Okay, and because of its nature, this will not be capitalism. All right, so let me wind up. Bottom line of this talk, we need to understand the Buddhist lessons of care and interconnectedness. We live in a world of global, ecological, and other interconnections where we flourish collectively or not at all. Let me end with a piece of poetry. I don't normally end with poetry, but I think this piece of poetry is really relevant. It's by John Donne, the English metaphysical poet. You can see his dates there. You may have met this. Let me read it to you. This is the original spelling. You may have seen it with modern spelling. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a man of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never send to who know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. That was wonderful, Dr. Priest. Very good. Looks like we will be ending in 5 minutes as well, but I will restart the same meeting with the same number. So you just stay right there. If we do get disconnected again,
Okay.
and I will be back in 30 to 40 seconds or 1 minute after that. I'm sorry about disruptions that have happened. Okay, we are ready for questions if anybody has any.
Do you want to ask the questions now or 5 minutes after 5 minutes?
Now is fine. If it gets disrupted, I will start again.
May I ask, shall I ask a supportive question or a challenging question?
Challenging is the first.
Ask whatever you like, Rohit.
Right. Okay. So my challenging question is this. We know that the current president, Trump, is not particularly enthusiastic about the environment project, right?
Sure.
And drill, baby, drill is one of his slogans, right? So we can see that the concern about care of the planet is not high on his list of priorities, right? Now one could ask the question, how is it that Trump is president, and what did the Democrats do before, let's say, before November 2024? What did they do in September, October, and so on, so on, right? And I watched their high priorities. The high priorities of the Democrats was not saving the planet. Their high priorities was increasing the number of abortions, ensuring access for transgenders to use women's restrooms, and open borders. And these three things turned out to be extremely unpopular. And as a consequence, we now have Trump for president. So one could ask the question, why did the Democrats not put the earth at the top of their priorities?
I don't know. You're an American. I'm not. You answer me. I mean, I'm not concerned with, the Democrats, the Republicans. I'm concerned with trying to get us, do what we can to address the mess we're in now. And lots of people have had a hand in this.
Okay, then let me rephrase my question. I assume that you're aware of the tragedy of the commons.
Yes, and what we see is effectively an instance of the tragedy of the commons.
Exactly right. So the other thing is, if one were to able to convince a lot of Americans, right? In fact, I think a lot of Americans are convinced that saving the earth is important. Then one could ask the question, how could they coordinate? Because in order for something to happen, they must sort of condense their power into a force which will reach into the White House. Because if you're just giving talks and lectures and so on, so on, maybe a few marches and demonstrations and so on, so that in itself does not solve the issue. So I would say that the issue of getting actions from people as individuals into people as groups is a crucial subject which needs to be studied, and perhaps there are answers there.
Yeah, certainly it needs to be studied, but more than that, we need to act on it. And it's not just a question of what happens in the US. Of course, the US is the major emitter, so that really is important. But this action has got to be coordinated across the world because it involves India, it involves China, it involves Europe. So there's a question of how.
I asked a question which I consider challenging. So let me just say one more thing, and then I'll stop. Namely, you use the word we, right? But who is the we? And I remember a joke from a very long time ago. I think, in fact, from a time when I was teaching in Bristol. And the joke was this: let's suppose that there was a petition for peace, right? And people had to sign it. And magically, every single human being on earth signed that petition for peace. And then the question arose, to whom shall we give this petition?
Sure.
Right? And I would say that in order for the word we to have a meaning, we have to take some of those, there are 77 million people who voted for Trump. We have to get 30 million of them on our side. And we can only do that if we are willing to moderate our positions, which they dislike.
Okay, look, it's not just an American issue, as I've said.
Yeah, China is the leader.
It involves global action by the human committee. Who is the we? The whole human race. Okay. How do we act in such a way as to do the things that I said were necessary. Okay, I don't have any magic bullet here, but certainly an important part of the story is getting people to understand the situation. So people need to understand the interconnectedness of the world, its people, and the way that we all thrive together or not at all. So education is going to be absolutely central to any effective action.
Yes, right. Okay. I'm sure other people have questions. So thank you very much, Graham.
Well, I just recently came back from Alaska just 2 weeks ago, and I firsthand recognized the melting of glaciers there and how it is receding so fast. So I do agree that environmental challenges are clearly there. The global warming is for real, and all the changes that are happening on Earth are serious. Now, with that, I think your or anybody's solution on just saying capitalism is not the one that will do it, capitalism is bad, and we need a little firmer answer than just saying that capitalism is not the solution for this. Don't you think so, that we probably need a more clear-cut answer if we want to revert all these things, which will be accepted by majority of the countries?
Yeah, look, I've argued that capitalism is the current cause of the problem, or a major cause of the problem. I've indicated why I think that things can't really start getting better until we get rid of capitalism. And then the question is, how do we do that? That's a question I have not discussed. Look, I published a book a few years ago on this question. It's called Capitalism, Its Nature and Its Replacement, Buddhist and Marxist Insights. So what I have to say on that matter can be found in that book, okay? And I don't think anybody has a clear idea of an ideal economic arrangement for the world, okay? But we know what some of the problems of the current system are, and we know some of the things we can do to make it better. There's a nice remark by Chomsky where he says, you don't have to have a plan for utopia in order to make the world better. You just have to know some of the things you can do to attack some of the causes of what's happening. And I think that's right.
Good. Thank you. Anybody else?
The contact of Professor Priest. Email.
Oh, I will send you his email, Ravi. Okay. Anybody else has any question?
Maybe I can follow up on Kishore.
Say that again.
Maybe I can follow up on you.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And I know there are two important economists here, so I'm going to offer something with a little bit of modesty and hesitation, right? But there are these two famous books written by Adam Smith, right? The Wealth of Nations, and I can never remember the name of this other book, but it's a book about morality, and it's a book which emphasizes the fact that we care what happens to other human beings, right? So these, even though the Wealth of Nations is seen as the foundations of capitalism and is the more famous book, the other book is just as important, right? And one could say that also I think that when we talk about capitalism, we usually think of big corporations, but I think that one of Smith's primary examples was not a big corporation, but one person trading with another person. I make your shoes and you make my shirt, and so you have shoes and I have shirts. I could not have made my shirt and you could not have made, right? So trading, so small businesses seems to have been a prominent model of Adam Smith. So now one could ask the question, is it possible to arrange a arrange a system whereby you can have the wealth-producing machinery, but at the same time, better distribution and better respect for the environment, right? In other words, to come up with a system which is possible to reconcile those two things: capitalism as the means for producing wealth, and Marx as the person who distributes the wealth better, and then see how we can also take care of the earth in that way. So I think combining these two things is maybe the urgent issue, rather than just say capitalism is bad, get rid of it, because it might be. I mean, obviously, one of the methods often suggested is to tax the rich, but if there was no capitalism, there would be no rich to tax. So it's a more complicated issue, and the Buddha would say, remember interconnectedness. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I mean, capitalism has produced a large amount of wealth. That's clear. Of course, the way that capitalism functions is not very equally distributed.
Yes.
But of course, there are methods of producing wealth before capitalism. I mean, the feudal economy produced wealth. The question is, how do we get a better system? And it's one where wealth works for people and not the other way around, and do this in a sustainable fashion. Now,
I would suggest.
Can I just finish?
Yes, please.
I mean, I don't have a design for utopia, okay? All I would insist is I agree with you that we have to think about how to do this, because it's really important. And the mere fact that it's hard work to think about these things is not a reason for not trying. I mean, clearly the world's economy is going to change. The way we produce our wealth in 1,000 years' time, if we're around long enough to be around in 1,000 years' time, will be different from the way we produced it 1,000 years ago. So we know the economic system is going to change. The only question is, how is it going to change, and how do we change it for the better?
Right. Yeah.
No, I think
Please go ahead.
You already suggested an answer, in that there is externality, what we call it, externalities.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is a tax which is of sensible magnitude on all externalities, and if such a tax can be implemented, then it will be sustainable, and it will solve the problem with capitalism. The only problem is how to get such a tax approved.
Yes.
Yeah, look, I agree to a certain extent. I mean, if it were taxed, that would solve the problem of externalities. How you do that when you'd have to have an act, the act would have to be global, otherwise the externalities would just move from one part of the world to another. But let's suppose you manage to solve that problem, that would get rid of the problem of externalities. It wouldn't get rid of all the other problems.
But that is the main problem, and externality can include all bad effects of capitalism.
Well, that we disagree about, because I think capitalism has many unfortunate effects on people, not just the environment. But that's, a discussion we can have.
No, I'm not talking only environmental externality, but also social and other externalities.
Well, I don't think a tax on externalities is going to cause many of the social problems of capitalism, like the poverty and the social disruption poverty causes.
Well, I think I want to give a more dire forecast about this, because I clearly, when we are talking about environmental problems and the Earth's problems, we need a cooperation among countries to come up with a solution. Yes. And given this environment, I don't see it is coming up in next 10, 15, 20 years. The way the wars are being fought, the way People are making cocoon in their own policy making. And there is just no international cooperation going on. I think UN is defunct, almost defunct as a thought provoker. And yeah, so I think I have a bad news rather than a very optimistic view that environmental problems will be solved in next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. Look, I'm actually very much in sympathy with your pessimism. I fear for the world of my grandkids, but that we should be doing what we can do. One thing is just get to people to understand the situation.
I agree. I fully agree. People don't understand, and those who try to understand in a wrong way, and they say, "Well, this will be overcome by the nature herself." And I seriously doubt that. I think it does need some very proactive policy making, and I don't see that is coming up.
No. Well, it might be solved by nature by wiping us out and leaving the planet to cockroaches. I mean, that will be quite a good evolutionary solution.
Yeah, nature wants to kill us. Yeah, you are right.
Yeah, but hopefully we can avoid that.
Hopefully. Well, as I said, the leaders have to come to senses. I think so, leaders who make the world decisions have to come together, but I don't see they are coming together. I see they are, in fact, finding ways to fight rather than cooperate.
No, I think that's true. And it's not just national governments. I mean, national governments are often driven by the capital interests of their countries. And so capital will act in its own interest. And that tends to be short term. It needs to make a profit in the next round of, dividend shares.
And every time we come together and we agree to do something, somebody breaks the rule and somebody else breaks the rules, and then we don't really get anywhere.
Yeah. Well, Rohit talked about the tragedy of the commons, and that goes hand in hand with the free rider problem, as I'm sure you know. So, I mean, I think I agree with you entirely. We have a problem, and what we need is international cooperation.
Absolutely.
Not disrupted by people who act in their own interests. I mean, we come back to the Buddhist ethics. You act in your own interests, then you're attached to those, and it's going to cause not only other people suffering, but you. And if you don't realize that, well, beware.
Unfortunately, here is my forecast. Is going to take another disaster like COVID, which will be having some worldwide consequences, and then probably will come to the senses, and probably that time. So it probably is going to go down before we can come up.
Yeah, you may well be right. Let's hope it doesn't go down too far with a nuclear war or something like that. I mean, one might have hoped that COVID would have made people realize that the interconnectedness of things and the things we need to do to look after the human race. My own reading of the situation is that it didn't really have much effect.
Correct. Very good. Anybody else has any comment?
Are there any rays of hope in the present political climate?
Well, I will make one more comment, which is hopefully of some relevance, right? I mean, I think when we talk about the question of we doing something, right, then the question we becomes very problematic, because does we include, for example, the 77 million who voted for Trump? And if it doesn't, then the we is not going to be effective. And if it does include the 77 million, then the we that includes those 77 million is going to do something different from what we are discussing right now. Okay, but now here's an issue raised by Kaushik Basu. Some of you might know. I mean, at least we've corresponded with him, right? He's a well-known economist, and he was finance minister for India at one time, and he was also the head of the World Bank. He's now a professor at Cornell, and he raises the following question, which I think that Graham would be sympathetic with, because the question is, because overlaps with philosophy, which is Graham's personal field, and also with his alma mater, namely London School of Economics. And the puzzle that Basu raises is the following: suppose you are speeding, right? Then this policeman will give you a ticket, and so the reason you don't speed is because the policeman will not give you a ticket. But then the question arises: what makes the policeman give you a ticket? Why should he give you the ticket in the first place, right? And then the answer is perhaps the policeman gives you the ticket because his supervisor will penalize him if he doesn't give you a ticket, right? So then the question then just goes one step further, namely, why does the supervisor act as he does, right? And in order to explain this paradox, because we don't have a first cause, at least leaving God aside, we don't have a first cause in society, but society does work, right? And according to Basu, the solution to this is a focal point. And the notion of focal point was popularized by Thomas Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005. And Schelling's example was, supposing there are two strangers, two people who arrive in New York City by train, and somehow they got separated and they want to meet. So what shall they do? There are hundreds of places where either of them could go. And Schelling said they will go to the information booth at Grand Central Station because it's the focal point. In other words, it's the thing that you think of when there are many alternatives, right? And so the system where you are afraid of the policeman giving you a ticket, the policeman is afraid of the supervisor is afraid of someone, and so on and so forth. And eventually it maybe even comes back to you as voter, right? That this whole thing is a focal point. And we all act according to that focal point, and nobody's sustaining it. It just is a focal point. Then to move from that focal point to another focal point may be very, very difficult. It's possible, but it's difficult. And an example of this is in Sweden. Sweden used to have cars driving on the left as they would do in England. And at one stage, they decided that cars would start driving on the right, just as it does in Europe. And then overnight, the Swedish law changed and the Swedish drivers started driving on the right. But I don't know whether humanity as a whole is as well organized as Sweden. But I would say that Basu's notion of a focal point, that we all do something because we expect others to do something. They do something because the others do expect something. And so we have a circle of causalities and influence, which doesn't have a cause at all. It's just a focal point.
Mm. Yeah, look, I agree in part with what you say, Rohit. I don't agree that people do things simply because someone tells them to. I mean, I don't not speed so I don't get a ticket. I don't speed because I don't want to crash. Okay. But I agree with you completely that what we need is collective action. Right. Collective action requires that people understand each other and act in coordination. Okay. Maybe that requires something like a focal point. It certainly requires that people talk to each other, understand others' points of view, discuss them, come to conclusions about what should be done. I think, people acting collectively is much more powerful than any individual. And that's the kind of thing we need to encourage.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. It was a very wonderful and very useful webinar. I will send an email to the executive committee this week that is coming up about SIA things happening. But otherwise, if nobody has any other comment, we should be able to close now. And thank you very much, Dr. Priest, for coming to give this webinar. It was wonderful, and we hope to keep contacts with you, and we invite you to attend future webinars for us too.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting.